All right, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, beginning of verse 1, it says, now reading the New King James, "Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, and that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness." And so this is an interesting text on a number of levels. Now, just by way of reminder, the theme of both of Paul's letters to the Thessalonians is Jesus is coming. Now, we all know that Paul didn't write the books in chapters and verses, but in the chapter breaks where they occur in the First Thessalonian epistle, there are 5 chapters, and there is a mention of the coming of Jesus in every single chapter. 5 chapters, 5 mentions of the coming of Jesus. And half of this book by volume, if you take out the salutations and the closures, half of this book by volume deals with the second coming. And so this was something that the Thessalonian brethren in particular were extremely disturbed by. And it seems to me that there were a couple of issues. The first issue was in the first epistle that if you weren't alive when Jesus came back, you missed it. And we see that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 in verses 13 to 18, where Paul addresses the situation that those who have fallen, that we who are alive and remain will not prevent those who have fallen asleep, died. Okay, that's a euphemism for died. And so it seems the natural reading in that text is that the Thessalonians were afraid that if you died before Jesus came back, you miss it. So Paul writes to correct that issue. Now we have a completely separate issue in the second epistle, and that is that we see in verse 2 that somebody is teaching that he's already come back. You see there in verse 2? Don't be shaken in mind or troubled either by spirit or by word or by letter as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. So now we have a second problem. Sometime in between the first letter and the second letter, somebody came along and said, y'all missed it. You've missed it somehow. And Paul says that day will not come, again verse 3, until there is a falling away and a man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. All right? And so we want to note, first of all, that Paul is clear that, number one, they hadn't missed the day of the Lord. And he says, do you not remember I told you these things when I was with you? All right, so there's the day of the Lord had not come, obviously, at that point in time. Now, there's another thing that has to be considered. And that is what Paul says has to happen before that day comes. He says, that day will not come, there in verse 3, unless the falling away comes first. So that's the first thing that has to happen. There has to be a great apostasy. That's what falling away is. It's an apostasy. There's a great apostasy. And then secondly, there has to be some individual revealed, a man of sin and son of perdition. And what does the text tell us about that man? Well, what it tells us, first of all, in verse 4, that he opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or is worshipped. Now, I think I was reading in the Christian Standard or maybe the English Standard. Does somebody have something yet? Rhonda, you got your... Can you switch to, say, the ESV for me real quick? And look at verse 4.
Who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship.
Okay, there you go. That's what I need. He said, he opposes, exalts above all so-called gods or things that are worshipped. That's a different rendering, and it strikes something different in our minds than the rendering that we're familiar with, for example, from the King James or New King James. But there is, above anything else in both of these situations, there is an exaltation of this individual above all other things. Whether it be other gods or whether it be in other words, whatever rendering you choose is the most accurate. This individual, this man of sin and son of perdition, has falsely exalted himself above all those things. But then says, and sits as God in the temple of God. Now the temple is not the physical temple, it's the church. Whoever destroys the temple of God, him will God destroy. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. You are the temple of God, or whose temple you are. So the temple in the New Testament, obviously when you're not talking about the physical temple during the days of Jesus, the metaphorical picture of the temple is that it represents the church. And so this individual sits in the church above all other things, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. In other words, worthy to be worshipped. Worthy to be worshipped. And then Paul says, do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? All right, so now we have to look at, in a historical setting, Paul wrote these epistles in the early 50s. The early 50s. I mean, and not the 1950s. I mean like the literal 50s, okay? And so he writes these letters. Now, through the course of history, can we find somebody that fits that description? Or the office of the papacy. The office of the papacy fits this description. Question. Does the office holder of the papacy hold himself up to be God?
He'll pray for your, you can't talk to God directly, maybe the legal wasn't that.
All right. What does he accept the worship and veneration of men? He most certainly does. You got to kiss the ring. That's right. What's that, Bobby? And he speaks as God. Now, let me add a quick caveat to that, okay? When Catholics speak of the infallibility of the Pope, they do not speak of his infallibility at all times. Only when he speaks what they call ex cathedra, which means from the chair. If the Pope sits in his, whatever the Pope says sitting in the chair is infallible. For example, a few decades ago, not too many decades ago, there was a big clamor among Catholics for the Pope to declare Mary as the equal redemptor as Jesus. And the phrase was co-redemptrix. And they had a petition with millions of signatures. And what they were clamoring for was for the Pope to sit in the chair and declare it. Because if he sits in the chair and declares it, it's as if God himself says it. Now, I believe it was John Paul was the one they were trying to give you an idea of the time frame. It's about 3 or 4 popes back. But they were wanting him to speak from the chair and declare Mary as equal to Jesus in the redemption of the souls of men. So if a man accepts worship, right, and claims to speak not just for God, but as God. And there's a difference in those two things, right? Is there a difference in speaking for God and speaking as God?
Yeah. If you're speaking for God, it was given to you, not as.
Right. I mean,
The place of.
yeah. I mean, every time I stand here, I better speak for God, right?
As if all the prophets.
Yeah. But I don't speak as God. But the Pope doesn't speak for God. He speaks, or he claims to speak for God, but he also claims to speak as God. One of his titles is Vicar, V-I-C-A-R, which is a shortened word, a shortened term for the idea of vicarious. Vicarious, which means to be in the place of. To serve, ma'am?
This was written before there was a Pope, though, so
Right.
who else could be the Pope? So anybody?
Yeah.
Not just the Pope.
No, and that's what I'm getting at is it.
Years before.
Yeah, this is many years before there was a papacy, and my point is, from the time Paul wrote this, what other singular figure fits this descriptive picture? And I can't see any other historical figure who fits the picture aside from the office of the papacy.
In my study Bible, in the footnote, it says, Paul mentions a man of sin, the Antichrist, not so we might attempt to identify him, but so we might be ready for anything that threatens our faith.
See, that's what I was thinking, that it was anybody who
Or anything.
takes it upon
that
themselves
says.
to take the adoration of people. And I'm not thinking of just one person, I'm thinking of anybody.
Yeah, but this person has to be identified. This person has to be identifiable. My point is, they have to understand there is a specific individual or office that's coming forth that that can be seen. That can be seen.
So he was just prophesying for the future?
Thank you. That's it. He's telling us what is going to happen. And by the way, I think we're going to see, and by the way, this is not the only descriptive term of the man of sin. There's more in the text. But I just want us to get a picture of who sits in the church. Who sits in the church? See, the temple of God is a general term for the entirety of the church. Who claims to sit in the church of God as God, accepting worship like God? I've shown you all the pictures of the bronze statue of Peter in St. Peter's Basilica. It's nothing but a bronze statue. But people have come by over the last 1,000 years, or however many, 500 years, whenever that thing was made, and they have rubbed that foot and kissed that foot so much that his toes are gone. I mean, they've literally rubbed that statue, rubbed his foot off. Not like the whole foot, but I mean, I've been there. I've seen the pictures of it, and you can see it online if you want to. Rhonda and I have been there. Billy and I have been there. You can see it. You can see where they've rubbed his toes off. And we sat back and we watched people coming in and even bringing their children and having their children touch it. And we watched people kiss it. I don't know if they roped him off during COVID or not, but we saw these things. And this is a statue. This is a statue of a person that they believe to have been the first pope. And so I'm just giving you a picture of what Catholics believe the Pope to be.
I wonder who they think the son of perdition is. If we think it's the Pope.
Well, probably what Dana read in her notes, they probably think it's some kind of reference to an Antichrist. But the description of the Antichrist is only found in the book of 1 John, and the description of the Antichrist doesn't match the description of the man of sin. Because, number one, the man of sin is a man. And the Bible says that there is a spirit of Antichrist, and that many Antichrists have already come. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 19 or 18. He said, you have heard that there's an Antichrist coming. He said, I'm telling you, even now many Antichrists have already come. And so we know that the man of sin is a man, whereas the Antichrist is a theology of sorts, an idea, rather than an individual. Because Antichrist just simply means to be against Christ. What are you going to say, John?
It can't be Peter. It can't be a reference to Peter, because that man of sin accepts worship, and we know that Peter wouldn't.
That's right. Yeah, Peter would not accept, and no man's worthy of worship. Yeah, that's a difference between a modern pope and the so-called first pope.
It couldn't have been any of the apostles. It could not have been, because they taught against that.
Yeah, Peter forbid worship on the part of Cornelius. Paul forbid worship on the part of the Lystrans. But Jesus accepted worship when people tried to worship him in the New Testament. So to go back to the word vicar, means vicarious, means in the place of. So when they refer to him as the vicar of Christ, they're speaking of him as if he is the personal representation of Christ on earth. That's what they believe. That's the name. Right? They worship him. They think that he can say things and bind those things on the entire earth. When only God has that prerogative. And so we have, in a very specific way, the only individual that I have ever been able to identify in these terms has to be the papacy. But this is not the only case that there is to be made. Okay? And let's keep reading. In verse number 6, it says, and now you know what is restraining, that is, restraining the man of sin, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. In other words, there's a restrainer who's restraining the revelation of the man of sin. And he's going to continue to restrain until the restrainer is taken out of the way. All right? Do you see that in the text? There's the man of sin. There's the man of sin, and he's being restrained. There's a restrainer, who has a hold on him. But then the text says that the restrainer will be taken away. And so when the restrainer is taken away, then what happens? What happens? He's no longer restrained, which means he can be what? He'll be revealed. So when the restrainer is taken away, the man of sin is going to be revealed. All right? And it says that all of this is already at play. In other words, getting to this point in history is already at work. Now I'm going to explain to you what I believe that is. No, and just again, assuming that this is the papacy, okay? Was the path to the papacy already at work in the days of the first century? Was the path to the papacy already at work in the days of the first century? So I guess we have to ask ourselves this question. How do you get to there? How do you get from the New Testament church and God's plan for the church, how do you get to here? Since it's one step at a time, right? Not just all at one time. I'll give you an example.
Well, it's going to be falling away. It's going to be man choosing his own path.
Right, there has to be a falling away. Yeah.
Falling away from the Word and essentially making our own way.
That's right. Yeah, you're leaving the path. You're leaving the doctrine and forging a path separate from what's revealed in the Scriptures.
And it's been going on since the beginning. There's always been a doctrine of man, some kind of doctrine.
Right.
The Pharisees had their own, you know.
Right, but here's my question. What type of apostasy are we talking about here? In other words, no. I mean, yes, false teaching, but where does the false teaching have to manifest itself to get from God's plan in the New Testament for the church to a system of to papacy?
Somebody has to.
Who said that?
Leadership.
That's right, Vince. Leadership. It's an apostasy of leadership. All right. So we have, for example, we have God's plan for the church, right? Every congregation autonomous, right? And every autonomous congregation, the leadership is what? Elders. So I'm just going to put an E in here, okay? Every congregation has elders. Right? Through the course of time in the first century, you ended up having a singular figure identified as a bishop. And the bishop would oversee a collection of elders. In other words, one well-connected, respected, powerful man serving in one of these elderships would assume a bishop position. And he would oversee a collection of churches. He was called, even though the Bible refers to elders and bishops as the same thing, they're not the same thing here. All right, so then when you get, and I'm just going to make X's, all right? So, once you get a collection of bishops, then where do we go?
It's like a pyramid scheme.
Oh, it ain't like one. Actually, there's a step between there and the cardinal.
Okay, what is it?
Archbishop.
Oh, okay. I forgot about that.
Arch means over.
Yeah.
Arch means over. So you end up with an archbishop who oversees the bishops, who oversees the churches. Then we end up with the College of the Cardinals. Right, after you have all these archbishops, then you end up with the College of the Cardinals. And then, which is a small group limited in it the number of participants. And then out of the College of the Cardinals, what do you get? And you get the Pope. Now, if you'll look at the history books around that time, what you'll have is, in the Roman government, you had leaders at the local level, and then those leaders are overseen by a smaller group, which are overseen by a smaller group, which are overseen by a smaller group, and you got to hear, and who was that? Caesar. And if you lay out the pattern for the leadership of the Roman government, and you lay out the pattern for the leadership of the Roman church, you know what you're going to see? That's right, you're going to see mirror images of one another. They're laid, you have the College of the Cardinals, and you have the Roman Senate. They're pictures, they're mirror images of one another. And by the way, this is no accident. This is no accident. Because in the earlier days of the church, say by about the 3rd or 4th century, the church ended up in cahoots with the Roman government, with Constantine. And then the church began to more and more mirror the Roman government. Now, so this is an apostasy of leadership. But we can see first of all, we can see how it happened over time, and we can see what it pictures. Now go back to verse number 6. I'm going to tell you that Rome is the restraining power. The one thing that kept all of this in check before it got to what we see now, Rome is the restraining power. Caesar. Let me show you something historical. Rome fell, I believe it was in about AD 596 is not right, it's 576. I think that's right, 576. Rome falls in AD 576. The first universal bishop, this is what he was called in the beginning, the first universal bishop over all the church was declared in AD 606. Boniface III was declared the universal bishop over all the church. He was the Bishop of Rome. 476. 476. Thank you. And then Boniface III is declared the universal bishop over all the church because there's a power struggle going on between the church that's centered in Rome and the church that's centered in Constantinople. There was a power struggle. And Rome won out.
Not only did he have power over the church, he had it all over the nation.
That's right. And when this came into existence, the Pope not only, like Bobby said, not only controlled the church, controlled the armies, controlled the heads of state. The church waged war as if it were a secular nation. You see,
So
that which is restraining is taken out of the way so that this can be revealed. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, it was you had to be that religion.
That's right.
So I mean, because you wonder how people, you think, if we read, how do you get so far away from what the disciples were teaching, but I mean, if your leader says, this is how we're going to worship, like if our president made us worship a certain way, a lot of people would just do it just to not get in trouble.
Right.
I mean, without question.
Yes. Yeah. If you're under the threat of death,
Right.
some people just do whatever, if they lack conviction, they just do whatever they need to do to stay alive, stay out of trouble. Which, by the way, was one of the problems that the early church faced even in the first century, insofar as that the Christians wouldn't pay homage to the gods of the unions, the guilds.
I guess what I'm thinking is you can just see why it became so powerful so quickly because of that threat.
Right, and also when you start seeing this departure, when these guys start getting together, then they start making new rules. But then when these guys start getting together, they start making new rules. When the College of the Cardinals gets together, they start making new rules. I mean, they didn't get there overnight. It took literally hundreds and hundreds of years to get from God's pattern for the church to what we see now. And so Paul says this is already at work. And we know that to be the case because Paul said, for example, to the church at Ephesus, or to the elders of Ephesus in Acts 20 and 29, even from among your own selves will men rise up speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. And we can see in the writings, we can see in the early writings of the church where this bishop system was already at play.
And it's weird, when we went to Rome and we went, it's their own country.
Oh yeah, Vatican City is a sovereign nation.
Right, that's what I mean, where all these popes and bishops and all of these people report to their, I guess what you call their, what's the word I'm looking for, their central, their
Headquarters.
I mean, it's its own country.
Yeah, and when
answers to nobody.
right, that's right, and answers to nobody. Answers to nobody. By the way, if I'd have just turned the page, Vince, I had 476 written on my paper. All right, so looking at the specific descriptions of the man of sin in the first 4 verses, and then looking at the historical context in verses 6, 7, and then 8, I don't see that there's any way to identify the man of sin and son of perdition anywhere else other than the papacy. Yeah, but I would welcome another alternative. Not that I don't want it to be the Pope. What I'm saying is, if there's another reasonable explanation, then I'm open to it. I'm just saying this is what I understand. This is what I understand it to be. And then I want to note also this in verse number 9, that the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and unrighteous deception among those who perish. The history of Roman Catholicism is littered with miraculous claims. Rhonda and I were in one of the little cathedrals, not too far from is it called Jewish Harlem? That was called? Not Jewish Harlem, Jewish, where all the Jews live, right there on the river. We went through there. Anyway, whatever. There's a bunch of Jews living in Rome. But you remember the little Veritas mask?
Oh yeah, that you stuck your hand in.
Yeah. If somebody didn't believe you were telling the truth, you had to give your testimony. It was like a cast, it was a carved out mask. It had giant teeth in it, and in order, it was called the Veritas. And when you gave your testimony, you had to put your hand in the mouth, and if you were lying, it'd bite your fingers off. If I'm lying, I'm dying. But I mean, it's right. I mean, but that's the kind of stuff.
I didn't know how we made it back with Todd's hand.
I know. I mean, you have weeping statues. Weeping statues, and all types of signs, power, lying wonders, and deception, unrighteous deception. There are all these claims. There are all these claims of the miraculous. By the way, in order to be canonized as a saint in Roman Catholicism, you have to be directly connected to two miracles. Two miracles. And by the way, the phrase "devil's advocate" comes from the people that were hired by the Roman Catholic Church to debunk any claims of sainthood. That's what their job was, to make sure that no unqualified person ever became a saint, and those men were called the devil's advocate. It was their job to try to debunk the evidence presented for sainthood. That might get you a Trivial Pursuit question right one of these days. Probably not. But again, all these signs, and all these claimed miracles, exorcisms, and all types of things. And you say, well, how do people believe this? Well, it's right there in verse number 10. All unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive a love of the truth. Just an ounce of discernment would solve a lot of these problems, right? Just an ounce of discernment would clear up a lot of these so-called claims of the miraculous. And then people who don't love the truth.
But it's so embedded in their everyday language. All these politicians, the rulers, and everything, when they speak of the church,
they're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. That's right. That's exactly right. And those that do not receive a love of the truth will be sent a strong delusion. That they'll do what? Believe the lie. People who do not love the truth will be strongly deluded, and they will believe a lie. That's why we have to be a people who love the truth. All truth. Not just the truth about these types of things. Because the minute we cease to love the truth, we make ourselves no better than anybody else that's been deceived in some way. All right, I had a few just particular notes, but I'm not going to read them because I think we've probably made the case. Anybody got any questions or anything they want to add to?
Do you think it started in this?
Boy.
Paul already mentioned
He did the departure. I don't know. I tend to think that Paul's warning to the church at the elders of Ephesus was probably common throughout the first century. And let me explain why. When you read 3 John and you read about Diotrephes, it doesn't say that Diotrephes was an elder, but it said that Diotrephes set himself up in the church and he told people who could come in and who couldn't come in. He allowed them in and he kicked them out. And that would be at least a picture of a bishop over a church. In fact, I may have drawn this a little bit too broadly. if I remember correctly, you had an eldership and then a bishop over a particular church, and then archbishops over those bishops. So I may have not have drawn it correctly. It may have been that there was an eldership in there, if I remember correctly, and then a bishop in every church, and then the archbishops.
When did they switch from elders to priests?
Oh, I don't know. Elders to I don't know
They're
when.
not elders, they're priests.
Yeah, I don't know when the priesthood. Of all the things I've ever studied, I've never studied when that priesthood was established.
Even if it did, it would have been stamped out, and records would have been burned, and those people would have probably been killed or run off.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. Those that are in power write the history books.
That's right. That's right.
Those that are in power write the history books. That's why almost all of if you read, for example, if you read scholarly works on church history, almost all of the sources for much of the church, say from the year 500 to 1500, is all Catholic sources, because they were in charge, and so whatever history was written, was written by those that were sympathetic to that frame of mind.
In line with them, or you weren't going to be.
That's right. Yeah. Don't write a bad report of us. It might not go well for you.
I remember my grandpa being afraid that John F. Kennedy was going to be the president. He told me because they were worried because he was Catholic.
Yeah, that was a big issue in 1960 when Kennedy was elected. The fact that he was a Catholic, and they were afraid of his connection. They were afraid of his connection to the Pope, which it didn't turn out to be what they thought it was. But yeah, it was a big. Matter of fact, I'd be surprised if my grandpa voted for Kennedy in '60. I'd be really surprised if he voted for him in '60. All right. Anything else? Any questions? No? All right.
Well, the reason Kennedy got elected, he got on TV and made the statement that he would not.
He sure did. Yeah.